At my nephew's wedding, my sister raised her glass toward the groom's employer, put on the smile she saves for people she wants something from, and introduced me as the sister who mooches off the family and hasn't worked in years. Someone's fork froze in midair. An entire table of strangers turned to study my face. I smiled back at them, because I'd rehearsed that exact smile for months. Then the man standing beside her went very still, set his drink down on the tablecloth without a sound, and I watched my sister's confidence crack open like thin ice. What none of them understood in that moment was that the man she was trying to charm had been quietly searching for me for 3 years. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, the channel where we sit with the overlooked women. The sisters, the daughters, the mothers nobody bothers to ask about, right up until the room learns exactly who they've been dismissing. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I'm 47 years old, and for most of that wedding reception, I stood near the back exit with a glass of champagne slowly warming in my hand. I've grown comfortable in the margins of a room. 4 years ago, I wouldn't have recognized the margins if I'd tripped over them, because I was always the center, usually at the head of a conference table, usually the person the meeting waited for before it began. I spent 2 decades building strategy for firms whose logos you'd recognize instantly. People use my work as teaching material in graduate programs. I built that career from nothing. No family money, no convenient marriage, no safety net underneath me. Self-made, people called me, back when anyone still remembered to call me anything. That night, though, I was just Vivien's sister. The unemployed one, the charity case, the woman you're polite to the way you're polite to a stray cat. I let them believe it. I had learned, slowly and painfully, that being underestimated has its own strange kind of peace to it. But I'd also learned something else. Being underestimated is a debt that eventually comes due, and somebody always shows up to collect. The phone call that changed everything came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, a little over 3 years before that wedding. I was standing in a glass-walled boardroom on the 32nd floor, one signature away from being named senior partner, 20 years of climbing, finally about to pay off, when my phone buzzed with my mother's name on the screen. I stepped into the hallway, half irritated at the interruption, and my mother said pancreatic, and then she said stage 4, and the floor beneath me seemed to disappear entirely. She was 71. The doctors gave us a timeline, and it was a short one, and I did the only calculation that mattered to me right there in that hallway with the city stretched out below like it belonged to someone else now. I could keep the promotion, or I could keep the time. I didn't agonize over it the way you'd expect. I walked back into that boardroom, withdrew my name from consideration, and watched 2 decades of ambition quietly rearrange itself into something smaller and more urgent. My sister Vivien lived 3 states away back then. I called her that same evening, and something she said to me on that call, quick, offhand, almost careless, sat unexamined in the back of my mind for 3 full years. When I finally understood what she'd meant by it, I understood everything about her. But that understanding was still a long way off, waiting for me at a reception hall with white tablecloths and a stranger's hand setting down a wineglass. Here's what people always get wrong about my sister and me. We were both given the choice. When it became obvious our mother couldn't manage on her own anymore, the family held one of those chaotic conference calls, 6 people talking over each other, until someone finally said the quiet part out loud. One of us needed to step back from our careers. Vivien was mid-level then. Still clawing her way up a company she was terrified of losing her footing in. When the question landed on her, she answered fast, like she'd rehearsed the line in the shower. I can't just throw away everything I've built. She needed us to hear the certainty in it before we heard the refusal underneath. And the uncomfortable truth is, I understood her completely. I know exactly what it costs to throw away everything you've built, because I was about to do it myself. Vivien wasn't a villain in that moment. She was a woman who'd spent years climbing a slick ladder and couldn't imagine loosening her grip, even for a second. So I told them I'd do it. I said it the way you volunteer for the job nobody else wants, half out of pride, half out of love, with no idea yet that the world keeps 2 separate ledgers, one for the people who stay and one for the people who walk away. I didn't resent Vivien for her choice back then. I want to be honest about that. The resentment came much later, and it never came from the caregiving itself. It came from what she eventually decided that caregiving meant. 2 years is an eternity when you measure it in pill schedules and appointment reminders. I learned the vocabulary of oncology the same way I'd once mastered corporate mergers, completely and against my will. I sold my condo and moved somewhere smaller so my savings could stretch further. I drove my mother to 6 a.m. appointments and learned to tell which nurses were gentle and which ones were simply efficient. My phone, which used to buzz constantly with people needing my opinion on something urgent, went quiet, and then it went silent altogether, and I didn't have the energy left to grieve that loss on top of everything else. Some nights, my mother would surface from the haze of medication with startling clarity. On one of those nights, she gripped my hand and told me something I've held on to ever since. "They will judge you by whatever room you happen to be standing in," she said. "Promise me you won't judge yourself that same way." I told her she was being theatrical. She reminded me she was dying and had earned the right to be. We both left. A real laugh, not a performance for anyone. That turned out to be the last good week we had. There's a strange mercy in not knowing which week is the final one until it's already behind you. My mother passed away that spring, and something curious happened at her memorial. People started talking about me as though I were also gone. Not grieving my mother, but grieving the version of me that used to matter. A distant aunt squeezed my arm and said what a shame it was that I'd given all that up, that I used to be so impressive. Wasn't I? Vivien flew in for the service, wore an elegant black dress, and cried in a way that drew comfort from half the room. By the time the reception wound down, she had somehow become the devastated daughter, and I had become the exhausted woman who'd merely been handling logistics. I overheard her telling a cousin warmly that she worried about me finding my footing again, as if I'd wandered off some path, rather than walked my mother the entire length of hers. I stood in my mother's kitchen that day, holding someone's casserole dish, and felt the last 2 years of my life being rewritten in real time by people who hadn't been present for a single moment of it. Nobody warns you about that part of caregiving. You sacrifice your visible life, and then the people still living visible lives get to decide what your invisible one was worth. Vivien was already constructing her version of events, and in her version, I wasn't the one who'd sacrificed everything. I was the cautionary tale. A year drifted by. I handled the paperwork that follows a death, which is its own exhausting profession, and I let myself feel very little for a while. Eventually, I started sleeping through the night again. Then my nephew Julian called with the best news I'd heard in ages. He was getting married. He'd met Grace, and she sounded steady and warm and exactly right for him. When he asked me to be there, something in my chest loosened for the first time in years. But near the end of that call, his voice dropped, and I could feel what was coming before he said it. "Mom's going to be there," he said. Vivien had raised him, though I'd always been close enough that he sometimes slipped and called me that too, and she's got her whole narrative about you not working. Could you just not engage with it? Just for the day. He was 23, dreading a scene at his own wedding, and I could hear both the love and the shame tangled together in his voice. I told him of course I would. I meant it. And it cost me something I didn't have a word for yet, because in that single sentence, my nephew had made clear which sister was considered the liability. Not the one doing the mocking, the one who might object to being mocked. I hung up and sat with the silence for a long while. Then I asked him gently where exactly he'd landed his new job. He said the name of the firm like it was nothing at all, Kestrel Strategy Partners. I kept my voice level and told him that was a respected firm. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Vivien had actually pulled strings to get him the interview. She was a manager there, and he was just starting as an analyst, learning the ropes. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant that too. What I didn't tell him was that I knew Kestrel intimately. I had gone head-to-head with that firm for over a decade, beaten them on some pitches, lost others. And years earlier, I had developed a decision-mapping framework, a method for comparing what a company claims it values against what it actually does, that had spread through the industry the way good ideas always do. Uncredited, absorbed, treated as common knowledge. The last I'd heard, Kestrel had folded a version of it into their entire operation. By now, it would just be standard practice there, the kind of tool nobody remembers ever had an inventor. And Vivien had spent years building her career on top of a foundation she had no idea I had poured, at a firm she'd never once thought to ask me anything real about. My nephew was working inside a company I used to compete against directly, under a sister who had climbed straight past a piece of my own work without ever knowing it was mine. I could have told him that night. I chose not to, not out of some elaborate plan, just because I was tired of being the woman who has to explain that she used to matter. Let them find out eventually, or let them never find out at all. I was going to a wedding to watch a boy I loved become a happy man. My resume was an ode to anyone in that room. The rehearsal dinner happened on Friday evening, in a private dining room at a restaurant where the staff refold your napkin the moment you left the table. Grace's family had money, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I wore the one elegant dress I'd kept from my old life and felt oddly like an artifact of myself. Grace's parents were kind in the careful, uncertain way people are kind to someone they can't quite place. And Vivien arrived like she'd personally reserved the room. New watch. New confidence, sharpened to a point. Within minutes she'd gathered a small audience by the window, telling stories that all somehow concluded with her being right about something. I watched Julian watching her with a flicker of admiration, and I understood exactly what shape the evening was going to take. Tonight, Vivien was the family success story, and every success story needs a contrast standing nearby to make it shine brighter. I took my wine to a chair near the edge of the room, which by then felt less like banishment and more like a strategic vantage point. From the edges, you notice things. You see exactly who someone becomes when they believe the people who matter are watching. And all night, Vivien kept glancing toward the door, waiting for someone more important than the rest of us to walk through it. That someone didn't make it to the rehearsal dinner, but his name came up constantly. Mycia, she'd say. Marcus is incredibly selective. You have no idea. She told a lengthy story about a presentation she'd once delivered, how he'd rejected the whole thing outright, how she'd stayed up until dawn rebuilding it, how she'd eventually won him over. She said his name, Marcus Ainsley, like a devotee invoking a figure she hoped was watching her from somewhere. She dropped it in front of Grace's father, who nodded politely. She dropped it in front of Julian, who beamed with pride at his aunt's proximity to greatness. And she dropped it while glancing my way, as if to make sure I registered the distance between a woman who answered to Marcus Ainsley and a woman who answered to no one. I said nothing. The name meant nothing to me. I'd left the industry before his time at the top, and I'd never crossed paths with him. But Vivien didn't know that either. All she knew was that I used to be somebody, and now, in her mind, I was nobody, and she wanted the ghost of my old self to witness exactly how far she'd climbed. It was Grace's mother who asked me kindly over the salad course, "And what do you do, Eleanor?" A simple, human question. I opened my mouth to answer honestly, that I'd stepped back from consulting to take care of my mother, and I was still figuring out my next chapter, which was the truth and nothing to be ashamed of. Vivien answered before I could get a word out. She gave a light little laugh and said, "Oh, Eleanor's between things right now. Has been for quite a while." She said it fondly. That was the cruelty of it, wrapped in warmth, so that anyone who reacted badly would look like the unkind one. Grace's mother smiled, uncertain, and steered the conversation elsewhere, and I sat there having just been introduced to my nephew's new in-laws as a woman defined entirely by an absence, as though the 2 years I'd spent holding a dying woman's hand were a blank space on a calendar instead of the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. Something in me, some old professional instinct that used to face down hostile boardrooms, went very still and very cold. "That's certainly one way to describe it," I said, and let it go, because it was Julian's weekend and I'd made him a promise. But I filed it away. Some things you file. I stepped outside for air after the outre, and Grace followed me. My nephew had chosen well in the way that matters most. She was someone who noticed when a person went quiet. She stood beside me without rushing to fill the silence, which told me everything I needed to know about her. Eventually she said, "Julian told me you took care of your mom for a couple of years. That sounds incredibly hard." That was it. That was the entire gift. She asked about the life I'd actually lived, instead of the emptiness people had painted around it. I told her a little. The early mornings, the nurses who were gentle versus merely fast, the last good week. She listened like it was worth hearing. At one point she said quietly, "That's not nothing. That's basically everything." I had to look up at the string lights for a moment to steady myself. It's a strange thing, Having your own nephew's new wife be the first person in 3 years to hand you back a piece of your own dignity. When we returned inside, Vivien was mid-story again, and Grace caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, private look that said, "I see exactly what's happening here." I had an ally now, though I had no idea yet how much I'd need her, or how little I'd actually end up relying on her. The moment that stayed lodged in my memory happened over dessert, and it involved paper. Grace's father mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his company might need consulting help down the road. Nothing urgent, just thinking aloud. Vivien moved like she'd been waiting her whole life for that exact opening. She dug into her bag and produced a stack of business cards, Kestrel Strategy Partners embossed in deep navy, her name in crisp lettering beneath it, and fanned them across the tablecloth like a winning poker hand, sliding them toward Grace's father with a practiced smile. Then she turned to me. She let the pause stretch just long enough for the whole table to feel it and asked, "Do you have a card to give them, Eleanor?" Anything at all. The table went quiet in that particular way tables go quiet, because everyone understood the real question wasn't about business cards. It was about whether I existed at all. I didn't have one. I'd left my old cards in a drawer 3 years earlier along with the rest of that life, and I hadn't bothered to make new ones, because I still didn't know what they'd say. So I sat there, empty-handed, in front of my nephew and his new family, while my sister's little navy cards lay fanned across the linen like evidence of who among us was real. I smiled and told her I was fresh out. She smiled back, satisfied, and the dessert arrived, and the moment passed for everyone else at that table. I carried it with me all the way to the wedding reception the next day. That night, alone in my apartment, I pulled a box down from the top shelf of my closet. Not paperwork, nothing I could have brandished at Vivien, just an old photograph. My mother and me at an industry conference, maybe 18 years back, both of us mid-laugh at something outside the frame. Me in a conference badge and a sharp blazer, her having flown in just to sit in the back row and watch me deliver a keynote she didn't understand a single word of. She used to do that, sit quietly in rooms where I was the expert, and just beam. I sat on my apartment floor with that photograph and finally asked myself the question I'd been outrunning for 3 years. If I'm not producing anything, am I still worth something? If nobody's keeping score, do I still count? It's an ugly question to catch yourself asking, because asking it at all meant some part of me had started accepting Vivien's math, the world's math, the equation that says a woman without a title is a woman without value. I didn't cry over it. I just sat with the photo and let the question be honest, because you can't repair a wound you refuse to name. My mother's voice came back to me from that final good week. Don't you dare judge yourself by the room you're standing in. I tucked the photograph into my purse. I couldn't have told you why. I just wanted her with me at the wedding. The morning of the ceremony, Julian needed help with his tie. He always had, since he was small. He came to find me in a side room off the Vineyard Chapel, tie hanging loose, wearing the same helpless expression he'd had since childhood. I stepped in and tied it the way my own father once taught me, his hands trembling slightly with nerves. I smoothed his collar and looked at the young man in the mirror beside me and had to breathe carefully for a moment. He caught my eyes in the reflection, and his face crumpled just slightly. Aunt Eleanor, he said, what I asked you on the phone about Vivien, that wasn't fair of me. I told him it was fine. It's just that she gets loud, and I didn't want. I stopped him there. Sweetheart, I said, this is your day, and I promise you I will not be a single ounce of trouble in it. That's a gift I'm giving you, not something I'm sacrificing. He hugged me hard enough to lift me slightly off my heels, the same way he used to when he was terrified of thunderstorms as a boy. Over his shoulder, through the window, I could see the vineyard filling with white folding chairs and arriving guests. I had made him a promise of peace, and I fully intended to keep it. What I didn't yet understand was that peace wasn't entirely mine to protect. Someone else was about to reach for the pin holding it together. The ceremony was lovely and mercifully brief, exactly as a ceremony should be. Then came the reception, an open-air hall strung with grapevines and string lights fading into dusk. I was seated well toward the back, near a great-aunt and 2 of Grace's college friends, which I understood completely. The front tables were reserved for the audience the day was truly performing for. From my seat at the back, I watched my sister orbit one man in particular, older, silver at the temples, wearing a suit that seemed to fit him rather than the other way around. He carried himself with the specific calm of genuinely powerful people, taking up exactly as much space as he needed and not an inch more. Vivien circled him the entire evening, refilled his glass unprompted, laughed a beat too long at whatever he said. Even from a distance, I recognized the choreography, because I had once been the person a room organized itself around, and I knew precisely what it looked like when someone desperately wanted to be arranged around instead. Then Vivien scanned the hall, found me at my quiet back table, and began walking my way with the man in tow. I felt it coming the way you feel weather changing. She crossed the room with Marcus Ainsley at her side, steering him directly toward me, and I understood immediately that I was about to be used as a prop, evidence of how gracious she was, how she generously tolerated her jobless, dependent sister, how far she'd risen above her own beginnings. Some people build themselves up. Vivien had only ever learned to build herself up by standing on top of someone else, and tonight, that someone was me, in front of the most important man in her professional life. I set my glass down. I straightened my spine the way I used to before walking into a hostile boardroom, an old, forgotten reflex from a life none of these people believed I'd ever had. Grace, across the hall, saw the direction Vivien was heading and started moving too, though she was too far away to reach us in time. Julian was near the head table, laughing, oblivious. Vivien arrived at my table glowing, gestured toward me with an open palm like she was unveiling something curious, and turned to the calm silver-haired man to make her introduction. I looked up at both of them and waited. Some moments announced themselves right before they fall. Marcus, Vivien said, bright and pleased with herself, this is my sister, the one I mentioned. Eleanor, the unemployed one, lives off the family. Been between things for years now. Bless her heart. She said it to a CEO about her own sister at a wedding, and she said it smiling, as though it were an act of affection. The great aunt beside me drew in a sharp breath. One of Grace's friends studied her plate very intently, and I did the thing I'd trained myself to do across 3 years of being narrated by people who'd never once been in the room with me. I laughed. Softly. Almost gently. Then I looked at this Marcus Ainsley and said the truest, quietest thing I had. She's right, I told him. I don't have a title anymore. I meant it in that first second as surrender. You win, Vivien, I'm done arguing with the story. But sentences have a way of turning over in your mouth as you speak them, and by the time it left my lips, it had stopped sounding like an apology, because a title had never actually been what made me who I was. My mother's voice moved underneath those words. Across the table, the calm man went very still, set his glass down slowly on the linen, and looked at me the way no one had looked at me in 3 years, like I was someone worth actually seeing. I'm sorry, he said to me, turning his attention entirely away from my sister. I don't think we've been properly introduced. What did you say your name was? His voice was courteous, low, and carried a new note of attention that hadn't been there moments before. Eleanor, I told him. Marsh, Vivien added quickly, unable to tolerate silence for long. She's a Marsh, same as me, obviously. She laughed again, trying to steer the conversation back onto tracks she controlled. His eyes never left my face. Eleanor Marsh, he repeated slowly, and I watched something surface behind his expression, a file being pulled from a shelf somewhere deep in his memory. Not the Eleanor Marsh. The one who developed the decision mapping framework. The great aunt looked baffled. A hairline crack appeared in Vivien's smile. Those were not words she had ever expected to hear attached to a sister she'd spent years diminishing. I wrote an early version of it, I said carefully, feeling my pulse climb into my throat. A long time ago. Marcus Ainsley let out a short, startled laugh, shook his head, and said, a long time ago. My entire analytics division still runs on that long time ago. The table had gone completely silent. Vivien's hand found the back of a chair to steady herself. He explained simply, which somehow made it worse for her, that Kestrel had adopted my framework across the entire company years earlier, that it functioned, in his words, as the spine of how they made every major decision. And that 3 years ago, when he'd stepped into the CEO role, the very first outside hire he'd wanted to bring on board was the woman who'd built it. Every recruiting cycle for 3 years, I had my team put your name at the top of the list and try again. You went completely quiet. No firm, No board seats, nothing. I assumed a competitor had locked you into an airtight NDA, or you'd moved overseas. I couldn't understand how someone that good simply disappears. My mother got sick, I said evenly. I stepped away to take care of her. She passed last year. Those words landed in the quiet hall with a weight even Vivien couldn't talk over. Marcus studied me for a long beat, then said, "So while I had an entire team searching every firm in the country for you, where exactly were you?" "At a hospital. Then a funeral. Then trying to figure out what came next." He nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted from professional curiosity into something closer to respect. Beside him, my sister had gone a specific shade of pale that only appears when a story you've told for years collapses in a single sentence, right in front of the one person you most needed it to survive for. Vivien had a choice in that moment, and I want to be fair to her, because there was a version of this where she recovered with grace. She could have said something like, "I'm so proud of her. Look what she walked away from." Instead, she let out a nervous laugh and said, "Well, I mean, that was ages ago, Marcus. She's not really in the industry anymore. Been out for years. You know how fast the field moves." She said it to diminish me automatically, reflexively, the way you'd swat away an insect. Except this time she said it to her own CEO, about a woman he'd just described as the backbone of his company, having minutes earlier introduced that same woman as an unemployed freeloader. Marcus turned his head slowly and looked at my sister, really looked at her, the way you reread a document and suddenly catch what you'd missed the first time. The warmth drained out of his face, replaced by something colder and far more final. He set down the drink she'd spent all evening refilling for him, and the whole hall seemed to hold its breath. Forks paused midair, string lights humming faintly, nearby tables now openly watching. "Vivien," he said, quietly enough that people leaned in without meaning to. "I've heard the way you talk about people in the office." I told myself it was ambition. Sharp elbows. "I gave you the benefit of the doubt." He paused. "But I just watched you introduce your own sister, a woman this entire firm owes a debt to, as an unemployed disappointment, at her nephew's wedding to impress me. That tells me everything I needed to know and didn't want to." Vivien started to say his name, started to say, "Marcus, please," and he raised one hand, not unkindly, just finally. "This isn't the place, and I won't turn it into one. HR will reach out first thing Monday. I think you already know why." He said it the way you'd mentioned the time. No raised voice, no scene. The most powerful man in the room had ended her career calmly, in under a minute, not because I was extraordinary, but because she had been cruel, and everyone at that table understood the difference. Vivien made a small, airless sound I'd never heard from her before. And here's what surprised me most. I didn't feel the triumphant rush I might have expected. I looked at my sister's composure shattering in front of Grace's family and my nephew, and what moved through me instead was something heavier and stranger, because one quiet sentence had just dismantled a woman who believed a title made her untouchable. Watching her, I realized I didn't actually want her destroyed. I wanted something else entirely, and I hadn't found the words for it yet. The table erupted in the hushed way tables do at weddings. Whispers, shifting chairs, someone rushing off to find Julian. My nephew appeared moments later, eyes wide, looking between his aunt, his mother, and his boss, trying to understand how his wedding had turned into this. Grace reached me first, coming around the table to stand beside my chair, one hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a young woman planting herself firmly beside the family member everyone else had spent years treating like furniture. I will love her for that until the day I die. Vivien sank into the nearest chair, as though her legs had simply given out. For one unguarded second, she wasn't angry, wasn't performing. She looked at me across the wreckage she'd built with her own hands, and something raw crossed her face. "You were always the one they remembered," she said, almost to herself. It came out of her like something she'd been holding underwater for 4 decades. And in that single sentence, I finally understood what she'd meant on that phone call 3 years earlier, the thing I'd never been able to parse. She hadn't refused to care for our mother, because she lacked a heart. She'd refused because she was terrified that if she ever stepped out of her own spotlight, even briefly, the world would simply forget she existed, because in her mind, the world had always defaulted to noticing me instead. Her cruelty wasn't strength. It was a woman gripping a slick rung, certain that letting go meant vanishing forever. I stood up. I think everyone expected some closing line, some final blow to settle the account. I didn't give them one. Instead, I walked over to Marcus Ainsley and asked for a private word, and we stepped away from the table, near a post wrapped in vines and light. Up close, he was even calmer, a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. "That was remarkable," he began. "What you built, I stopped him gently. "Mr. Ainsley," I said, "I need to ask you something, and it's going to sound unusual." He waited. "Please don't fire my sister because of me. If she's violated a policy your company takes seriously, that's entirely your decision to make, and you should do whatever your business requires. But I need to know it isn't a gift to me. I've spent 3 years being defined by other people's stories about me, and I refuse to start my next chapter by watching a woman lose everything on my behalf. That's not a victory I want my name attached to." As I said it, I realized I wasn't only talking about Vivien anymore. I was drawing a boundary around how I would let the world hand me anything from that point forward, whether insult or reward. I intended to be the one holding the pen. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying me the way you study something you weren't expecting to find. Then he smiled, a genuine one, the first I'd seen from him all evening. "You're exactly the person I spent 3 years looking for," he said. "Now I understand why I never found you. People like you don't leave a trail. You leave a legacy and quietly walk away from it." Then he turned businesslike and made me an offer, and it was a serious one. Not a consulting contract, a leadership position, a seat at the very top, running strategy for the entire firm. He named a salary large enough that the great aunt, still eavesdropping from a few feet away, made an audible sound of surprise. He said Kestrel would announce it however I wanted, that he'd personally ensure the industry knew Eleanor Marsh was back, that the record would be corrected with a single press release. He would hand me back in one afternoon everything the last 3 years had quietly taken. Then, to close the offer, he reached into his jacket and set one of his own business cards on the small table between us. Heavy stock, his name embossed above his title, right there for me to take. A card. After an entire weekend of having none to offer, a man was placing the finest one in the room in front of me, offering to make me visible again, entirely on his terms. I looked down at that card and felt the whole weekend, the whole 3 years, narrow down to that single small rectangle and the decision it was asking of me. I won't pretend I didn't consider it. This story has had enough dishonesty already. I considered it seriously. Every part of me that had gone hungry for 3 years leaned toward that card. "Take it," that part of me whispered. "Take the title, the salary, the announcement. Walk back into your old world vindicated. Let the entire industry that watched you disappear now watch you return in triumph. Let Vivien read about it in the trade papers." By every measure I'd used for 2 decades, this was the win. This was the door I'd walked away from, swinging open a second time. Except now nobody was dying, and I could simply say yes. But wanting something and needing it turned out to be 2 very different columns on a balance sheet. And my mother had taught me how to read one. Because if I took that card, I'd once again be a woman whose worth was granted from the outside, handed down by a powerful man, printed on paper I hadn't chosen, restored under someone else's letterhead. I would become real in exactly the way Vivien measured real. I would win at her game. And a person who wins someone else's game has still agreed, quietly, to keep playing it. I looked down at the card and heard my mother's voice from that last good week, clear as anything. "They'll measure you by the room you're standing in. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way." I finally, completely understood what she'd been trying to hand me all those years ago. Here is what 2 years at a hospital bedside had actually taught me, even though it took a business card on a cocktail table to help me finally read the lesson. I had spent my entire life believing my worth was whatever value I produced for other people. Build the framework. Close the deal. Run the room. And you're worth exactly as much applause as you generate. Stop producing, and you become someone between things. That was the arithmetic. It was the exact same arithmetic that had convinced Vivien to refuse our mother. The same one that kept her clutching those Navy cards like a life preserver. The same one that had nearly convinced me, alone on my apartment floor with an old photograph, that a woman without a title was a woman without worth. But I had done the single most valuable thing I will ever do in a room with no applause in it whatsoever. I had sat beside my dying mother for 2 years that nobody clapped for, nobody credited, nobody would ever list on a resume, and it had never been a gap. It had been the fullest, truest work of my entire life. The world had labeled those years empty. The world was simply wrong. And I had nearly let the world's judgment overrule the evidence of my own hands. My mother had seen this exact moment coming years in advance. She hadn't been telling me to build a bigger room than my sisters. She'd been telling me to stop letting rooms do the measuring at all. I looked up from the card at Marcus Ainsley, and for the first time in 3 years, I knew all the way down exactly what I was worth, and that it had never once been printed on anything. I picked up his card. I held it a moment, long enough for him to understand exactly what I was about to refuse. Then I set it gently back down and slid it across the table toward him. "Thank you," I said, and meant every word of it. "You have no idea what it means that you remembered me. You saw me when my own family had already decided I was a cautionary tale. I'll carry that with me." He waited, because good negotiators always sense when there's more coming. "But I'm not taking the position," I said, "and it isn't pride. I chose the words the way I once chose them in boardrooms, except now they belonged only to me. You offered to restore me, to correct the record, to put me back where I supposedly belonged. But I never lost myself out there, Marcus. This industry just forgot how to see clearly. That was never mine to fix by accepting a better chair. I don't need restoring. I need to build my own table. And I'd like the first question at it to be, not 'what's your title?' but 'who did you take care of?'" He was quiet for a long moment. Then Marcus Ainsley laughed softly, picked his card back up, tucked it away, and said, "Most people take the chair, Eleanor. In 30 years, you're the first person I've ever offered one to who'd rather build the room instead." He extended his hand. "Then I'll be your first client. And don't fire your sister for my sake. I heard you clearly. Whatever I decide about Vivien, I'm doing for my company, not for you. That distinction belongs entirely to you." I shook his hand. I had arrived at that reception with nothing to offer anyone, and I left having turned down everything, and I had never in my life felt wealthier. "I want to find my nephew." Julian was standing near the wedding cake with Grace, looking like a young man whose perfect day had just cracked straight down the middle. When he saw me, his expression asked a dozen questions at once. I took both his hands and told him his wedding was still beautiful, that none of what had happened was his to carry, and that his aunt was more at peace than she'd been in 3 years, which was entirely true. He asked quietly whether it had been awful, what he'd walked into. "No, sweetheart," I told him. "I think it was the opposite of awful. I think it was the night I finally got myself back." Grace hugged me, and over her shoulder I looked across the hall to where Vivien sat alone at the abandoned table, her navy cards nowhere in sight, staring at nothing at all. I didn't go to her. There was no fixing that night, maybe no fixing it ever, and I'd made my peace with that possibility. But our eyes met across the room, and I didn't gloat and I didn't glare either. I gave her one small nod. Not forgiveness exactly, just acknowledgement. 2 sisters, raised under the same roof by the same unspoken rules about who gets to matter, and only one of us had just walked free of them. She looked away first. I turned back to my nephew and his new wife, took a fresh glass of something, and let the wedding be a wedding again for whatever remained of the evening. Later, once the dancing had started and no one needed me for anything, I slipped outside and stood in the vineyard darkness, listening to the music drift out behind me. I still had my mother's photograph tucked in my purse. I pulled it out and studied it under the string lights, the 2 of us laughing at some long-forgotten conference, and told her quietly that I finally understood what she'd been trying to give me, and that I was sorry it had taken so long to hear it. For 3 years I had walked out of rooms feeling myself shrink a little more in every doorway, feeling some invisible ledger subtract from my worth each time. That night, I walked out of a room feeling exactly my own size for the first time since she'd died. No title. No business card. I'd turned down a fortune and a throne, and I stood alone in the dark holding a photograph of a woman who was gone, and I was not, in fact, between things. I was finally at the beginning of my own thing. The music kept playing, the lights kept swaying, And somewhere behind me, my nephew was dancing with his wife while my sister gathered her coat to leave early. The world hadn't changed one bit. It was still measuring people by the rooms they happened to be standing in. But I had changed completely all the way through, and that turned out to be the only measurement I ever needed to correct. That was a little over a year ago. Here's what became of everyone, since I know you'll want the ending. I built the firm I described to Marcus that night. Marsh Strategic Partners is intentionally small, just 3 of us and a handful of clients. Marcus kept his word and became our very first one, which quietly opened doors I never had to knock on twice. It isn't an empire, and I don't want one. I've already lived the version of my life that chases the biggest room available, and I have no interest in returning to it. This firm is enough. It's mine, and it measures the things that actually matter. Vivien left Kestrel that following Monday. It's a small industry, and word travels fast, and the story followed her for a while before she eventually landed at a smaller firm in another city, a rung lower, still gripping tightly. We aren't close. I've stopped waiting for that to change. Some fractures don't heal into something stronger. They just heal enough to stop bleeding, and you learn to carry the scar and the distance together. The world's arithmetic hasn't changed either. It still worships titles and still calls a caregiver's years a gap in the resume. I couldn't fix that, and I've stopped trying to. But Julian and Grace come for dinner often now. Grace is expecting their first child. And my nephew hugs me these days like a man who finally understands exactly what his aunt is worth. That's the ending. Smaller than a fairy tale, but truer than one. It turns out the 3 years I was taught to call empty were the fullest years of my entire life, and a person's worth was never something that could fit neatly on a card fanned across a tablecloth. Last week, I interviewed a woman for a position at my firm, 3 years out of the workforce, caring for her ailing father. Her hands trembled when she reached the gap on her resume, bracing for the question everyone always asks. I didn't ask about the gap. I asked her to tell me about her father. She started to cry, and then she started to talk, and I knew I'd hire her before she'd even finished her sentence. A photograph. A quiet laugh. A man setting down his glass without a sound. If there's a quiet woman in your life carrying more than any room can see, tell her today.